Ladies and gentlemen, I warmly welcome you to today's webcast. My name is Matthias Ammann. I am the Managing Director of the UBS Center for Economics in Society, here at the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich. Actually, Dina Pomeranz was looking forward to welcome you at this point. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency, she is unable to attend. And so I have the honor of hosting the webcast with Lorenzo in her place. Today's topic concerns one of the world's most important challenges, land and economic development in Africa. The African continent includes 54 countries with about 1.3 billion people. Despite large progress in poverty reduction over recent decades, almost a third of Africa's population still live in extreme poverty. Development economics plays a crucial role in understanding the factors that shape the well-being of people in low-income regions. And it provides evidence-based insights to help people lift themselves out of poverty, improve their livelihoods, and create opportunities for long-term growth. By studying the economic realities faced by many of people around the world, development economists can identify effective policies and interventions that can transform lives, strengthen communities, and foster sustainable development. Today's webcast will explore the important role of land in shaping Africa's economic future, offering new perspectives on how we can foster more fair and prosperous societies. I'm very pleased to welcome Lorenzo Casaburi to the studio to share his research on these questions. Lorenzo is UBS Foundation Associate Professor of Development Economics here at the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich. His research primarily explores economic development in different countries of Africa, with a particular focus on agriculture finance, competition, and indeed land markets. His research provides important insights into the role of land in shaping the economic course of the region. But before we start, I'd like to give you, our audience, some logistical information. Lorenzo will be conducting live interactive polls throughout his presentation. And you will also be able to ask questions, which we will then take up in roughly half an hour after Lorenzo's presentation. To participate, please open a new tab in your internet browser on your phone or computer. Go to menti.com and type in the code 25109570. Even if you don't have any question, you can still log in to view all the questions submitted by other participants. You can also vote for the best ones by giving them a thumbs up. All right, Lorenzo, the floor is yours.
Great. Good afternoon. Thanks very much, Matthias, for the kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to present today at this event. And so why is the topic of my talk land? Well, land is arguably the most important physical asset for many of the poor in the global south. This is especially true in many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, where agriculture is the largest employment sector. Many people in these countries are working on a plot, typically a small plot, and they get their livelihood from this land. Now, for a long time, the conventional view of land markets in Sub-Saharan Africa was that land was abundant. So somebody could always get more land by accessing land that was not used before. And therefore, land markets were not that important. Now, things have been changing over the last few decades. And let me highlight three broad patterns that are contributing to such a change in landscape. First, population growth. Population in Africa has been growing from about 200 millions to 1.3, 1.4 billions as of today. Second, we are observing growth in the share of population that lives in urban areas. This number is about 40% now in Sub-Saharan Africa, and the growth has been aligned with the pattern in other low-income and lower middle-income countries. And the third is climate change. We are observing an increased number of droughts, flooding, and other extreme climate events. It is predicted that mortality induced by climate change will primarily concern poor countries, including many countries in Africa, indeed. And besides mortality, we are concerned about other phenomena, like, for instance, climate-induced migration, where people move from areas that are affected by these negative climate events to other areas, both within countries and moving internationally. So these and other forces are contributing to increased pressure on land resources around the continent. And in response to these increased pressures, we have been observing changes in land tenure and more generally in the land system landscape. So we are seeing, for instance, changes from customary and communal property rights to formal and individual tenure. In many countries in Africa, also in many other places, including the Western world pre-industrialization, we have seen customary land rights, in the sense that land administration and land allocation was based on local practices and norms, often not written laws, and communal property rights, in the sense that land was typically owned by communities, by villages, by clans or extended families. We are observing a shift toward formal land system with laws and individual tenure, where land is owned by individuals or nuclear families. So on the right map in this graph, in this slide, you see in blue countries that are implementing land formalization programs according to our own search. And you see effectively that most of the continent is implementing this type of land formalization. And I'm going to talk about Uganda, a country where I do my research, to try to characterize a bit more in detail this change in landscape. Before that, I think we are getting to the first question for the audience today. So I would like to get your inputs, your opinions, on what you think the effects of these changes in land tenure are for economic development. Do you think that these changes bring positive effects, maybe neutral effects, or negative effects? Okay, so you can go to Menti, you can dial the code that Matthias mentioned earlier, and we will discuss your answers in a couple of slides. I look forward to seeing your opinion on this. But let me zoom in on Uganda. So Uganda has been at the forefront in Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of modernizing land system and land administration. This is through, for instance, the creation of a digital land registry that is leading to having granular parcel-level database. And so I've been collaborating with the Ugandan Ministry of Lands, Housing, and Urban Development to analyze data from this digital land registry. And so as part of this collaboration, we've been accessing data for several regions in Uganda. These are the ones that you see in blue in the map on the left of the slide. And so we can quantify some of this transformation. So the first thing that you notice in the graph on the right part of the slide is that there has been a substantial increase over the last decade in the number of registered land parcels in this digital land registry. That is, in the regions for which we have data, again, the ones in blue in the left map, this is about 1.5 million parcels that are now entered in the digital land registry. And with this process of registration of land parcels in the land registry, we also observe a growth of formal land markets in the country, again referring to the regions for which we have data so far. So we see that on average in the last few years, there were about 20 to 30,000 transactions, formal transfers of land parcels in Uganda. And then we also see an increase in the number of mortgages, in the number of transactions where landowners can use land as a collateral for a loan that they receive from a formal financial institution. So land as a tool to access formal finance in these settings. Okay, now this brings us to the polling results for the first question. And I can see that the audience is somewhat split. Maybe a majority, 71%, thinks that these changes are going to have a positive impact on economic development. And 29% thinks actually the effects are going to be negative. And so this question very much relates to the rest of my presentation. So what I'm discussing is some recent economic research, including some of my own work, that tries to understand the implications of this change in land systems on economic development. And more precisely, we are going to look at three aspects of economic development. The first one is agricultural productivity. It is well known that on average, agricultural productivity in Africa is low. On the first graph in this slide, you can indeed see that the average yields are much lower in Africa than in other continents or macro regions, and that this gap is increasing. So how can land contribute to agricultural productivity? The second dimension of economic development that we're going to study is urbanization and more generally land use. To which extent land systems interact with how land use on how land is used. And finally, conflict. We have very granular data on conflict events, and we can understand the relation between land transformation and the incidence of conflicts. So this is a bit the roadmap for the rest of this talk today. And indeed, let me start with agricultural productivity. I'm going to present some research on the relation between the growth of land markets in rural areas and agricultural productivity. Let me start with an important fact. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, that's been known for a long time by economists, agronomists, and many others, that average productivity, average agricultural productivity is low. More recently, in settings where sufficient data are available, we have also been learning that there is a lot of dispersion in agricultural productivity. Let's say within the same village, there will be some farmers who have pretty good yields and farmers who have very low yields from their plot. Now, interestingly, it has been documented, for instance, in work by Chen, Diego Restuccia, and co-authors, that productivity, agricultural productivity, is uncorrelated with farm size. Now, in a well-functioning economy, we would expect better farmers to gradually expand and to get larger farm sizes. This lack of correlation points that this is not happening that much and potentially suggests misallocation. What do I mean by misallocation? Is this idea that potentially there could be large gains from reallocating land from, let's say, worse farmers to better farmers who can produce more efficiently. For instance, this reallocation may happen through land market transactions, such as sales or rentals. Now, why don't these transactions happen, or why they don't happen sufficiently to generate a stronger correlation than what we see in the data? Well, there are many possible frictions or imperfections in this market. Let me give a couple of examples. One is the concern about land disputes. Okay, maybe as an owner, I don't want to rent out my land to a potential renter because I fear that once the renter stays on the land, I will not be able to get access back to the land after the initial rental contract is over if I wanted to do so. On the other hand, potential renters or, let's say, potential buyers may be concerned that if they get access to a new plot, they may actually not have sufficient security to stay on the plot. This is just one example. Other examples, for instance, include concerns about soil exhaustion. Maybe owners are concerned that renters would overexploit the land that they stay on. And so what's the thought experiment that as researchers we want to ask to understand, to test this misallocation hypothesis? Well, the thought experiment we would like to perform is one where we try to understand, okay, what happens if we induce more land market transactions? And will they have a positive effect, for instance, on agricultural productivity or not? Or there are reasons why it could have a negative effect, for instance, if renters are not experienced in cultivating this plot. So ex ante, the effects of inducing new land market transactions on productivity could be ambiguous. And what we've done in research in Kenya is to actually go from this thought experiment to an actual field experiment where we have generated this type of variation in land transactions. And so my next question for you, before I tell you more about this experiment in Kenya and before I show the results, is how does inducing land rentals affect land productivity? Do you think that renters compared to owners are going to maybe have lower land productivity, similar land productivity, or better land productivity? And I give you here several potential ranges that could, that could be found in our study. Okay. So again, I look forward to go back to your results, to your answers in a couple of slides. Before doing that, let me tell you a bit more about what we actually did. So this is work with two co-authors, Michelle Acampora and Jack Willis. And it's work in Kenya, in several counties in Western Kenya, to be a bit more precise. So what we did, we interviewed about 7,000 farmers in 160 villages. And we collected information on, for instance, how many plots they had and how big these plots were. Then we asked to each of these landowners, we asked whether they would be interested in renting out one extra plot, often actually the first plot to rent out for them, if they received a rental subsidy that was worth about 30% of the average rental price. In other words, we asked them, if as part of this study, we offer you 30% in addition to what the renter will pay to you, would you be interested in renting out an extra plot that you will not be interested in renting out without the subsidy? So the goal here is to move on the margin the owners to enter the land market. About 16% of the sample, 521 owners, say that they will be interested. And this is the main sample of for the study. So what we do, we randomize these owners in 3 groups. So we randomly allocate, think of a lottery, through 3 groups. One, the gray, is a pure control in which they do not receive subsidies or any other help. The main treatment of interest is a conditional rental subsidy. If they rent out the plot, and we have several ways to verify that, then in addition to what the renter pays them, they receive an additional 30%. And then we have a group, which we can call a benchmark treatment group, in which owners are offered a similar amount of money, but they do not need to rent out. So you can think of this group as giving a similar amount of money while leaving the plot to be cultivated by the current owner. So in this group, in the green group, we do not induce a change in land, in who manages the land. Okay, and so now to the total polling results. They seem a bit spread. And so, a majority of you predicts a positive effect, 42 between 0 and 25%, 32 between 25 and 50%. And some of you predict a negative effect. And again, ex ante, each of these may be possible. I should also mention, before showing the results from the actual experiments, that a number of previous studies have tried to predict the effect of these new land transactions. Of course, that's a very difficult exercise. Often they will get very large numbers. And this is the first study where we actually can see what happens in reality thanks to this experimental approach or randomized control trial. So what do we see in the data? Well, one good measure of productivity is the value of the harvest at the crop harvest. And for this, we measure different crops with prevailing prices in the market. So we price a crop even if it is not sold. And so what do we see? We see that in the control group, the one that does not receive any support, the harvest value on average is about $94. Now, this goes up to $109 per season, I should mention, per crop season per plot, when owners receive the support directly, when they receive a cash drop, but they do not need to rent out. And when instead, through our experiment, a change in land manager is induced, we see that the value of harvest goes up to $133, and this is a significant increase. The previous one, we would say it's marginally significant. Okay? And so these results show that inducing rental transactions on the margin increased the value of the harvest on the plot. Okay? And it increased by about, I think, 45%. Now, where do these gains come from? In the study, we analyzed several mechanisms. Let me point out two important ones. So the first one is that renters seem to be more likely than previous owners to invest in commercial crops, in crops that are maybe more productive and can be sold. We see that the share of plots cultivated with commercial crops goes up from 9% to 19%. We can also get some insights by comparing characteristics of owners versus new managers, versus renters. So what do we see in this comparison? Well, we see that renters are much poorer than owners in terms of land ownership, which is the most important form of wealth in this context. So we see that owners typically were owning 2.16 acres of land, and renters would own less than half of that, one acre. And so in this case, it seems that rental markets are allowing people who want to cultivate but who don't have much land to access new land. So potentially the land markets here are having a redistributive role, as it has been found, I should mention, in several previous studies. Renters, compared to owners, also appear to be younger, about 5 years younger, and appear to be more educated. 34% of the renters had completed high school versus 24% of the owners. So better education may contribute to increased productivity and better management of the plot. Now, we also see that renters are more likely than owners to be male, 87% versus 69%. And so one could be concerned about the fact that these rentals are transferring land from women to men. Of course, this does not say anything about welfare. Maybe the women are better off renting out their plot, getting the rental money, as opposed to spending time and effort cultivating that plot. Okay, so let me move to the second domain of economic development, which is land use and the relation with land tenure. So there is a spatial correlation between formal tenure, formalization of land rights, and urbanization. The left map here points at the cities, the orange dots in the left map. The map on the right here shows in the regions for which we have data, again, the blue areas, where we actually see registered land parcels. And you can eyeballing, there is some correlation. A more formal test also suggests a correlation between urbanization and property rights. Now, the question is there a causal relationship, and which way? Is it the case that when a parcel gets registered, or when there is, for instance, individual tenure, then we see a change in land use, for instance, a change from crop or trees to buildings? Or is it the case that in areas where urbanization is growing, where land use is already changing, then people using the plot request and try to apply for formal tenure and, for instance, for freehold titles that give full rights on the land? So ex ante, the causality could be going both ways, and it is typically hard to understand which of the two is correct, which one holds in the data. So now I go back to those data that I was describing earlier for Uganda, in the collaboration with the Ministry of Lands and with co-authors from the Ministry of Lands and from the University of Zurich, so Jimmy Alani, Martina Jacob, Joseph Mivule, and Sistina Mundu. So here we zoom on a specific region of Uganda, the one that you see in the map, the Mbarara zonal office. And what do we observe in this area? Well, we see growth in, or a growing number of land that is converted from customary to freehold tenure. So if you see, this is in red, the number of parcels converted to freehold by 2016. And you can see that this number grows substantially over the next 7 years. So all the new red that are there in the final and not at the beginning period are pieces of land that got converted to freehold tenure, mostly from customary tenure. And so now we can ask, looking at these super detailed events at a parcel level, we can ask what happens to land use around this event. And let me show the results here. So what do we find? We find that, well, and first of all, let me tell you how to read this graph. So in this graph, for instance, we use remote sensing data that allow us to codify land use or to predict land use. Of course, it's not perfect. And indeed, I should mention that some work in progress that we are doing is about refining this measurement. But so with the data that we have for now, we can get an estimate of land use for each 10 by 10 pixel in the region of interest. Okay? So for instance, in the left graph, we are looking at the prevalence of crops. And on average, in this area that I referred to in the previous slide, about 7% of the land is used for crops. Okay? Now, in this graph, the red vertical line is basically the period in which there is a conversion of land tenure from customary to freehold. Okay? And the dots before and after tell us how land use is changing before and after the event. And so it does appear that even before, and I should mention the time horizon here is semester. So -1 means 1 semester before the event takes place, and so on. So what can we observe? Well, we can observe that in periods that already before the conversion, there is a change in land use. There seems to be a reduction in crops and an increase in the prevalence of buildings on the right graph that take place before the conversion occurs. So this is consistent with the owners either anticipating that this will take place or requesting, applying for a change in land tenure as their land becomes used differently. For instance, if I have a building on it, I may want to be sure that I have full rights over the land. Okay? And so on the other hand, we don't see, there is not clear evidence on what happens afterwards. It doesn't necessarily seem that once the tenure is granted, there is immediate or major changes in land use. Again, this is work in progress. We are refining some of the data. But with this graph, I want to show how this granular data enable us to nail a question, a very broad question, like the relation between land use and land tenure at a very specific level and with very precise information. Finally, I want to talk about the relation between land and conflicts. So many scholars, policymakers, stakeholders are concerned that the formalization of titles and the transition from communal to individual rights may lead to more disputes and violence. What are some of these concerns? Well, one, for instance, elite capture. Maybe when land gets allocated to individuals, the elites in a given community can make sure that they get disproportionately large amount of lands. Second, it has been shown in several studies, for instance, in a nice paper by Le Rossignol and others recently, that communal property rights serve an insurance role. So, for instance, if a household is hit by a shock, then they may get more productive land through the communal allocation system. With individual rights, this is, of course, not possible. Some are concerned about international pressure, the role of foreign governments and foreign companies in acquiring land, the so-called land grabs terminology. Another concern is about conflict of interest within a community across groups. And indeed, let me give you an example here. Let me point at a very recent study by McGurk and Nunn in which they look at land conversions for agricultural projects. So these are projects exactly in which large amounts of land get allocated to agricultural projects. Think of plantations or other type of intensive agriculture. Now, when these projects take place in areas that were already in agricultural communities, there doesn't seem to be an increase in violence. So these are the orange dots in this graph that, again, is taken from this paper by McGurk and Nunn. On the other hand, when these projects take place in areas where pastoral communities were present, so they were using the land for pastoralist purposes, not for cultivation, we see that the incidence of conflict after these land conversion projects take place doubles pretty much, or increases substantially. And so again, this is another example in which by bringing good data on these agricultural projects and on the extent to which conflict take place, we can get precise estimates on the impact of land use on conflict, which is, of course, one of the important dimensions that policymakers have been concerned with. Okay, this brings me toward the conclusion. So I'm gonna maybe summarize and then discuss a couple of policy responses and policy implications. So what have we learned from the presentation today? So many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are experiencing major changes in land systems, in land tenure, and a growth of land markets. As it is often the case when an economist gives a presentation, we have highlighted trade-offs. On the one hand, some of these changes may lead to improved productivity, improved economic efficiency. On the other hand, there are some negative effects, like recent studies pointing, for instance, at the importance of the conflict responses. Now, I also hope that I've explained how researchers can contribute to provide evidence on these issues that I should say are very heated. Okay, every time I travel to Uganda or to Kenya or to some of the other places where I do work, I notice how crucial and how important the land sector, land issues are for everybody, from high-level policymakers to the farmers I talk to in my field work. And so how can researchers contribute? Well, one example is by applying this experimental approach to land policy issues. This is something quite novel, and with the hope that the results from these studies can inform evidence-based policy. Second, this process of digitization of land registries is creating large-scale, granular administrative databases, parcel-level information, the researchers, as I've shown in a couple of examples during this talk, can use for their analysis, again, to contribute with rigorous evidence to this type of debates. Finally, let me discuss a couple of policy responses to this change in landscapes and to this pressure that I have discussed in this presentation. So first, I should mention that arguably the modernization of land registries of cadastral systems is something that is broadly desirable. Having security of rights, security of transactions is important. Should also mention that, of course, it's also much easier to tax for the governments transactions where they are formally registered. Okay. The second point I want to make is that modernization does not necessarily mean a change in tenure rights. For instance, several countries now are formalizing common property institutions, are clearly demarcating communal land without pushing for a shift from communal rights to individual rights. So it's important to separate these two concepts of, let's say, demarcation, formalization, and individualization. And finally, as pressure increases, as land use changes, there is a growing role for land use regulation and for spatial planning. And so again, mentioning Uganda, Uganda has recently drafted the first national physical plan that combines inputs from higher level government, but also from bottom up, from local council, local communities, to come up with a coherent and consistent spatial planning policy for the next 20 years. And I think this is the type of policy that is going to be very, very influential. With this, let me conclude. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for this great talk. But before we start with asking questions, I would like to encourage you, our audience, again to submit questions. So please go to menti.com and log in with the code 25109570. So it's my privilege as host, of course, to ask the first question. So you mentioned Kenya, an experiment in Kenya where the landowners actually had concerns to rent out their land because of land disputes, soil over extrapolation. So how did it turn out in the end?
Yeah, thanks very much for asking this question. So we actually follow these relationships between owners and renters that we induce in our experiment for over 4 years, actually, so for many crop seasons. And so what do we see? We see actually maybe contrary to these maybe pessimistic beliefs that some owners were having, we don't see many land disputes emerging. And we actually see that the constructive relation between owners and renters continues even after the subsidies that we were paying at the beginning are no longer paid. So we see that this experiment incentivized the creation of the relationships, but then these relationships organically continued after the study. And so, or after the intervention in later year of the study. And so to us, this suggests that the beliefs about the risks of this market may be overly pessimistic. And that, as it has been shown in other settings, inducing people to participate in markets may actually improve the beliefs that they have about how well these markets work. I should also mention one other concern was the concern about soil deterioration. So to test these, we measured the soil quality, collecting soil tests and sending them to labs to analyze. And at least in the period for which we have these tests, it doesn't seem that quality deteriorated. Now, of course, it could still be the case that deterioration emerges after 10 years. That we'll have to track even for longer, these plots.
Just to get it right, so your experiment was not only a one-time experiment, so you run it over time, and then there you can see that less and less landowners are actually afraid of renting it out.
So there is a distinction between the timing of the intervention. So we gave these subsidies to rent out for 3 crop seasons. This is 1.5 years. But then we collected data for much longer, so for up to 4 years. And this is what enables us to say, to observe that this relationship continue between owners and renters, and that owners reported being happy to be able to rent out, even after we stop giving the subsidies.
And are you doing these experiments only in Kenya or other places, and only in one place in Kenya, or different locations?
Yeah, so we are focusing on, this complete experiment is in Western Kenya, okay? And then we also have more at an early stage in Ethiopia and in Uganda. Okay?
And you're getting the same results, or?
Oh, it's too early stage to say. So next webcast in a few
years. Okay. So let me turn to the first question from the audience. So I go through the top questions. We have one. I read it out. How can insights from your research be integrated into broader economic development strategies to enhance food security and poverty reduction in rural communities?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Of course, a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that my colleagues, my fellow development economists do aims to influence policy. Okay, we care about the academic, but we also care about the policy impact. So I think there are several elements that are important to stress here. One is that projects, the nature of the projects often involves collaborations with local organizations. This can be NGOs, can be government, can be private sector companies. And it's important to have this collaboration in early stages when the project is designed, and then throughout. And so, for instance, I think the partnership with the Ministry of Lands in Uganda is a good example on this. And then it takes effort to translate results that are from one study into more general policy implications. And I want to emphasize that it's important that academics contribute to this, but they also rely on people who specialize, who have these skills specifically on how to relate results to general stakeholders and policymakers. And so as one example, Uganda is now undergoing a review of their national land policy. Okay? And so I recently attended a conference that was about sharing insights from research, from field projects, to contribute to the revision or to the new edition of this national land policy. So it takes time, and one wants to be involved when the topical moments come up to have a window of opportunity over these policy changes.
Mm. So maybe let's step back and get the bigger picture. So what was the main motivation for your experiment in Kenya? Mm-hmm. So what's the main motivation to kind of do something against starvation, or to better use land, or what was the main?
Yeah, so I would say there are two questions that many studies are contributing to. One is to which extent inducing land market transactions can foster productivity. And we can think productivity as a fundamental of economic growth and poverty reduction and food security. Okay? And what we noticed, this was now several years ago, is that a lot of the studies were trying to predict these effects, but there wasn't actually any study that tried to induce these transactions and rigorously measure what would happen. Okay? And so I think this is a classical question in development economics, to which extent markets, including land markets, can foster efficiency, and this is an experiment that gets directed to this point. The second, which I touched lightly, is there is a big question about the redistributive impact of land markets. So we show that in our experiment, land rentals allow actually poor farmers who don't have much land, to access land through rental markets. Now, in principle, it could also be the opposite. It could be that farmers who rent out are strapped for cash. They need to rent out, and the ones who take over the land are richer. Mm-hmm. Okay? And at least in our context, this does not seem to be the case, on average, of course. So it does seem to be the case that renters are poorer than owners. Of course, this may be very different when we talk about land transactions, like land sales or large-scale leases. In our experiment, the plots were very small. Mm-hmm. If one talks about renting out large plots of land, results may be very different. And indeed, this is something that we are hoping to study in the Ugandan context.
Okay. Can you say something about that? How, I mean, the farmers who rent out their land, was the land like equally big as they owned, or?
No, so thanks for asking. So these farmers typically will have 3 plots, mm-hmm. and they would rent one of their 3 plots on average. And also in the experiment, for ethical reasons and for a number of other motivations, we only gave incentives to rent out at most 1 plot. We didn't want to run the risk that somebody would alienate their entire land.
And the plots rented out were the same size, more or less?
There was some variation, but on average, they were of similar size to the plots that were not rented out. So on average, people were renting out about 1/3 of that land holdings.
Okay. So let's turn to the next question. What do you think is the most important lesson for governments or international bodies when it comes to balancing land rights with economic development priorities?
It may not be a particular regional reason, but it's acknowledging that there are trade-offs, that there are going to be winners and losers, and depending on the setting, depending on transactions, this is almost inevitable. And so understanding that, for instance, if we want to push agricultural productivity, this may imply that some farmers that are not very productive have lower access to land. And this creates important problems that must be tackled by policymakers concurrently with the changes in the land sector. Understanding if now farmers must be working on a larger farm or must be provided some other type of social insurance, it's something that cannot be fought too long after. It must be a problem that is tackled concurrently with these projects, with these conversions that we are seeing.
But can you already see some issues with it?
Yeah. I mean, I think this idea that demarcation and formalization does not have to be one-to-one, which changes toward individual tenure systems, I think very much comes from acknowledging that in many settings, the push toward the individualization of property rights was leading problems. And so it was important to unbundle the two components. One can conduct a surveying and demarcation without necessarily immediately transferring land rights from communities to individuals. So that's, I think, very much in line with this type of logic.
Okay. In your view, what roles should development finance institutions and NGOs play in scaling up land tenure reforms? Are there specific areas where external funding can have the most impact?
Yeah, so for instance, in this Uganda modernization of the land registration, the World Bank played a big role in funding the project. And you know, it's safe to say that this big creation of a digital land system will not have happened without this type of institution. I think that more generally, it is important to you know, foreign donors and development finance institutions play a role, and as much as possible, these interventions, when they are scaled up, should be informed by good evidence and on the multiple dimensions that can be affected by this type of projects at a small scale.
So the banks, they have a business case. So they're benefiting from like your research.
This, I guess, depends a bit on the type of project, etc. But sure, one could say that, for instance, when there is a land tenure modernization, one thing that we have seen is that land can be used as a collateral for a mortgage. Okay, and so this is a case in which there is an interaction between the fact that owners can have a certificate on the land and can use it for a loan, and of course the business of the development finance.
Okay. So what role do you see for private sector actors such as agribusiness or fintech companies in shaping the future of land access and economic development? So it goes in the same direction.
So very good. So let me give a concrete example that is at the top of my mind. I was talking now some time ago with a startup in Kenya that is trying to apply methods to achieve economies of scale on farms without necessarily creating consolidation on land. So one of the advantages of having large plots is that one can use, I don't know, tractors or irrigation. This requires bringing a lot of plots together, okay? Now, this organization, at the time called Cinch, had a technology or argued that they could actually achieve some of these benefits, for instance, micro-irrigation on a large scale, but without necessarily having the plots to be consolidated. And so this is one example in which technological innovation can interact with land systems and can innovate on land systems. Yeah, so that's...
So can you elaborate on that? So people could log in and say, we're having space.
Exactly.
Shall we share?
Yeah, it's maybe a bit less techy than that, but it's more the company will go around and help farmers, small farmers that are in the same area, but without necessarily asking that all the land is managed together exactly at the same time by just one person. Okay?
Okay. So in countries like Rwanda, there is a reverse to informality post-land tenure efforts. What are some of the ways to incentivize land tenure registration and land transaction that follow after?
Yeah, exactly. So people like researchers like Klaus Denninger, Dan Allen, and co-authors have been looking at what happens after land registration take place, after this type of digital land register is created. And one thing that we observe is that it's not enough to create it, but it's important to sustain it. Okay? And so, as it is often the case in this type of interventions, one must think not just of the setup cost, but of the marginal user cost. Okay, so how costly is to register a transaction? Okay, also on the state capacity side, how is it possible to monitor transactions? Because, for instance, for taxation purposes, governments have an incentive to keep transactions recorded. So this is a complicated problem, and of course, lowering transaction cost for formal transaction. It's not a particular original solution, but one that clearly is going to be very, very important. For researchers, of course, while I highlight the importance of this granular administrative data, it is important to continue the other type of data collection, which is primary data collection with surveys, because in this type of surveys, one can get a sense of how important the informal transactions that are not recorded in the administrative data are.
Yes, I mean, you were referring in your talk that you're having a rich data set and especially new large-scale parcel-level data. And you thought of like a new opportunities in using it. So
yeah, I think I should say this is more general. As new data come in, researchers can ask questions, either new questions or questions at a level of granularity that was not possible before. We have seen this in many other settings. Including from very poor countries. Now we see much more data that are available, for instance, for social insurance questions. Okay, so with this premise, to be a bit specific, right, I showed how one can use this detailed data to understand the impact of these conversion events on land use. That's one example. To other areas, one can study concentration of land ownership, if one can match individuals across different plots to understand whether concentration is going up or it's going down. And another is understanding, and I think this is very important, how non-related land interventions interact with land markets. Okay, so let me give a concrete example. There is a recent paper by Nicola Limodio and co-authors that tries to understand the interaction between increased internet penetration and land markets and access to finance. And so this is pointing at the fact that when people can use the internet, for instance, to access the land register or to access online financial markets, fintech, there may be a multiplier effect to the provision of the internet.
Okay. How do you explain the increase for the unconditional cash drop group, investments in productivity?
Yeah, this is consistent with the fact that owners may be cash constrained. And so if more money becomes available for them, they could invest in a plot. They may start cultivating the plot when before they were leaving it idle. So it's consistent with what we know from other types of cash transfers. And given that sort of this effect is somewhat expected, that's exactly the reason why we wanted to benchmark our main treatment, which was the rental subsidy and the induced land rentals, with a transfer to the owner. And we see that while the transfer to the owner has a positive effect, it is smaller and statistically smaller than the effect of inducing a change in the land manager.
Yeah. So inducing is an important part, right?
Yeah, exactly.
To kind of get it going.
Yeah.
So in the region you have analyzed, are owners mostly locals or foreigners? Is there a specific foreign country that you figure out very active in acquisition of land?
Yeah, this is something that in the data that we cannot yet look. My sense is that, let me mention some other literature, for instance, by some other research by Tom Jane and others, that point indeed that, of course, land acquisition from foreign countries, foreign owners get a lot of the media attention, but the vast majority of transactions is between locals. Now, one thing that I've casually observed, but it's also been documented in other studies, is that there are a lot of transactions where educated, rich people who live in the cities, let's say in Kampala, in the capital, get land back in their family home village. Okay, and so this will be not foreign citizens, but there will be a bit of an interaction between urban citizens and rural areas.
Okay. But is it allowed for foreigners that not are living in these countries to buy?
Depends
land?
on the country. For instance, one common type of tenure is leasehold, in which foreign individuals or entities get leases for 49 or 99 years. That would be one type of common transaction that the foreigners utilize,
okay.
Or common type of tenure title that foreigners utilize.
So this is the last question from the audience. How does the EU impact the productivity of African agriculture and African agriculture the African agriculture guy Luxembourg. Actually, I don't know what it's meant, but
I mean, of course, this is a bit far from the topic of today's presentation, but it is well understood that, for instance, subsidies to farmers are a barrier to trade from African countries. This has been, discussed in many settings, and so it's important to acknowledge that some of these policies that may benefit European citizens imply distortions on the other side. Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on that?
No. I mean, it's important to understand, to quantify this impact, and to be aware of this global impact in the moment in which one evaluates the local policy landscape.
Yeah. Okay, but maybe we have another question from the audience, but I have another one. I mean, we were talking a lot about experiments, right? Mm-hmm. But can you explain how such an experiment looks like? I mean, how does it work?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, with regards to your question about policy influence, field experiments done in development economics, or more and more also in the global north, are done in collaboration with local organizations. So it implies having a partnership with, let's say, with NGOs that are interested in understanding, for instance, in this case, land, how to expand land access. And so a lot of the work that I do, that my colleagues do, involves steering and maintaining collaborations with this type of institutions. And so let me give you maybe another example from my own experience. I've been working on agricultural finance, on testing new insurance products, and this requires collaboration with private insurers, then requires collaboration with the regulators that must allow you to test new products in compliance with the existing laws, okay? And so there is a lot of work that is not strictly academic, but it's more about management. It's actually maybe not that different from businessmen that try to create business partnerships. I think there's a lot of that. And so I think this is a skill that maybe is not fully reflected when one reads the papers, but that takes a huge role in making a project successful. And then, in terms of the experiment, very briefly, the experiment itself, I think a major difference, or an important aspect, is that when one wants to try, let's say, to offer new loans, okay, to new type of loan, one can only randomize access to these loans. One cannot force people to take a loan, of course, nobody will want to that. And so there's a whole set of methodologies that is how we analyze experiments in which there is what we call imperfect compliance, in which we can only generate eligibility variation, but not force people, as obviously it should be. So there's a lot of practical aspects that come in that I think are important.
Thank you again for your great talk and for your explanations, and thank you, audience, for participating today and sending us your questions. We hope that we stimulated your interest in our upcoming events. On October 31st, we will have our Forum for Economic Dialogue on the topic of AI. This event aims to look beyond the hype surrounding AI and tries to answer questions such as how is AI promoting economic growth and who might benefit most from it? Does AI have the potential to increase prosperity and reduce inequalities? And on November 14, we will have a joint event with the Università della Svizzera Italiana in Lugano on the role that corporate culture plays in successful business today. By combining insights from economic research and real-world practice, the speakers will shed light on key questions such as, why is corporate culture so crucial? So, if you would like to receive updates on the events and activities of the UBS Center, please subscribe to the newsletter. In the meantime, I invite you to follow and continue the discussion on social media. LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, or X. You can find all these information on the UBS Center's webpage as well. ubscenter.uzh.ch. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.